Did you know that from 1903 to 1905 that America's leading car producer was not Chevrolet or Ford, but instead it was Oldsmobile? And Oldsmobile would have a number of ups and downs over the years, particularly after it became part of General Motors in 1908. Its worst model year was during the Depression in 1932 when it sold only 18,846 cars. But by the late 1970s, Olds was humming and was actually number 3 in sales behind Chevrolet and Ford. In fact, Olds had set sales records for a number of years, beginning with 1977, when 1.14 million cars were sold in that particular model year, and a similar amount were sold in 1978 and 1979. This was during the time frame that the Olds Cutlass was the best-selling car in the United States. Kind of hard to believe because it really wasn't a cheap car. And in later years, that crown would be bestowed upon cars like the Chevrolet Cavalier, for instance, the lower-priced Econoboxes. But the Olds Cutlass was a great vehicle with great styling, great ride, and I won't say great quality, but relatively good quality overall. It's kind of hard to believe that Olds would actually be number 2 in sales, given that the brand is obviously now extinct. However, by 1987, Olds sales were down to just 671,000 units, its worst overall sales since the mid-1970s, and Pontiac had regained third place in sales for the domestic brands. That decline would continue, and Olds would sell just 530,000 units in 1988 and 89, and then would dip under 500,000 units in 1990. Now, how in the world can Oldsmobile go from selling 1.17 million units, a record number in 1985, to less than half of that just 5 model years later? What happened? We're going to talk a little bit about that in this particular video, because the demise of Olds really started in that period from when it hit its record sales year in 1985 through 1990, and Olds never recovered since that point in time. Well, let's start with a couple things. One issue that Olds had was the product and the product replacements specifically. So in its record-selling year for 1985, this was the last year of the 1979 to 1985 E-Car Toronado. And the Toronado that was produced from 1979 to 1985 was a significant sales success. In fact, it was the most successful Toronado that was produced to date. The car had been downsized significantly from the 1971 to 1978 model, but it still had a presence on the road, and it sold really well in many of its model years. In fact, even in its last model year, the 1985 Toronado sold 42,185 units, and it would routinely sell in around the 40 to 50,000 unit mark in each of the model years in which it was offered for sale between 1979 and 1985, with a little bit of a dip in 1982 when it sold just 34,000 units. Regardless, that Toronado was powering Olds sales pretty significantly and drawing customers into the showroom, and it was its most expensive vehicle. In 1985, the base price of a Toronado was almost $17,000. That'd be a little over $50,000 today. Again, that's the base price before options. It was a very expensive car, and it was helping Olds significantly when it came to profitability. Now, the other thing let's talk about is the Olds lineup in that record-setting 1985 model year. We already mentioned the Toronado, but you also had a number of other vehicles in the showroom that sold well. The first year of the front-wheel drive 98 was 1985, and the car sold very, very well, almost 180,000 units. It was the best-selling 98 to date, amazingly. And buyers accepted the overall smaller package and enjoyed the vehicles, except they did have some quality problems and some teething issues, most particularly the transmissions in these front-wheel drive 1985 model year Olds 98s. Then there was the rear-wheel drive Delta 88. The Delta 88 would not transition to front-wheel drive until the 1986 model year, but the Delta 88 was still a very, very solid seller in 1985, selling over 200,000 units. Then, of course, you have the Cutlass, the old school Cutlass that was something that had been redesigned in 1978 and was downsized to 108.1-inch wheelbase. It was still selling well in 1985, with about 230,000 units that were sold in 1985. Then you have kind of the mainstream Cutlass Sierra, Olds' mainstream A-body vehicle. This would be the same platform that would, upon which the Chevrolet Celebrity, the Pontiac 6000, as well as the Buick Century would be produced. And the Olds Cutlass Sierra was selling in significant volume in 1985. Almost 300,000 units of the Sierra were sold in that particular model year. Then you had the new for 1985 Olds Calais, the N car, that was introduced to replace the X cars, and it sold pretty well too. It sold about 120,000 units. Then at the bottom of the lineup was a car that wasn't a great seller. This was the Olds Forenza. This would not be the last year of the Forenza, but it was certainly on the wane during this time frame, selling a little under 50,000 units for 1985. All told, the entire lineup, as I mentioned, was a record sales year for Oldsmobile. We mentioned that the Tornado was a big part of Oldsmobile's success during this time frame. And then in contrast, in 1986, when the new downsized Tornado would come out, the old Tornado had a wheelbase of 114 inches. The 1986 Tornado, by contrast, was down to just 108 inches, and it was significantly smaller. It just didn't have the presence that the old vehicle did. On top of being smaller, the base price of the 1986 Tornado went from $16,800 to $19,418 in 1986. So you got less car for more money, significantly more money. And that was not a recipe for success for Olds Tornado buyers, and they rejected the car. So the first issue was that Tornado sales actually reduced by 2/3 year over year, from 42,000 units to just 16,000 units in 1986, despite the fact that the car was quite a handsome car. And that generation of Tornado, which was introduced in 1986, would never be a great seller, despite the fact that Oldsmobile gave it a little bit of length in its later years. 1992 would be the last year for the Tornado, in which it sold just about 6,000 units. What a far cry from what it would sell in 1985, the last year of the previous generation. So one issue was the Tornado just was replaced with a vehicle that didn't have the same volume. Another issue was that the Cutlass was replaced, and the Cutlass Supreme Classic, the rear-wheel drive Classic, would last through the 1988 model year. 1987 would really be the year in which I would call it the last year of significant push for the Cutlass, where it was still marketed. And in 1987, the car was still selling well over 100,000 units, and it would be replaced in 1988 with a new Cutlass Supreme front-wheel drive car. And that Cutlass Supreme, the front-wheel drive Cutlass Supreme, just didn't have the same, I would say, sales. It didn't have the same draw to the showroom that the previous model did, unfortunately. Another factor in Olds' demise was the plummeting sales of the Olds 98. And unfortunately, while 1985 was a record-setting year for the Olds 98, by the time 1990 rolled around, it was really just selling a little over 50,000 units, 55,000 units, a far cry from what it was selling, pretty much 2/3 less in terms of sales than the 1985 model year. And I think what happened there was that customers really liked the package of the 98. It was a car that was much smaller on the outside, but it felt roomy and big on the inside. But as I mentioned, those 1985 model year Olds 98s just had significant quality problems. Everything from transmissions that I previously said, to steering rack issues, to window regulator issues, even drivability issues, stalling issues. It just was unfortunate, and I think that the car was rushed into production a bit, and General Motors engineering resources were overtaxed during that time as they tried to shrink pretty much every vehicle in the portfolio. And as a result, my guess is that customers, as an example, who bought a 1985 Olds 98 or leased it, when their lease was up or it was time to get a new car, they just didn't get another Oldsmobile, unfortunately. The 88 would also similarly suffer. Interestingly, when the 88 would transition to front-wheel drive in 1986, just like the Olds 98, it was a pretty successful transition. And the car would sell about 230,000 units in 1986. But by 1990, the Olds 88 was selling about 120,000 units per year. So roughly half of what it was selling just a few model years before. And again, I suspect some of that was really related to the quality challenges that happened. Another issue here is that one has to look at Oldsmobile in the context of the overall General Motors lineup and what was happening at the time with the lineup as well as the company. Recall that Pontiac during this particular time frame launched its "We Build Excitement" tagline. And Pontiac was having a great sales years in the latter part of the 1980s with that campaign and a number of new and youthful vehicles. And I suspect that Pontiac ended up stealing some sales from Oldsmobile because of the success of their campaign. The other piece that I think confused buyers was that no one really could discern what was an Oldsmobile any longer versus a Buick. And Buick sales were taking off at the same time. So I think that what ended up happening is that Olds, in addition to some product missteps, really got lost in the overall General Motors lineup because customers didn't know what differentiated an Oldsmobile from a Buick. And because the cars had become so much smaller and had transitioned to front-wheel drive, many of them looked alike. The A-body cars that Oldsmobile produced looked almost the same as the Buicks, aside from some front and graphics as well as rear end graphics, despite the fact that most of the sheet metal was actually different. And that was true of the Olds Forenza. That was true of other cars in Oldsmobile's lineup, the C&H body cars, the Olds 98 as well as the Olds 88 when they went to front wheel drive. So the cars increasingly looked alike because there was just less real estate. The cars were smaller and it was harder for designers to differentiate them. Despite the fact, again, that there was a lot of unique sheet metal on these cars, they did share roof lines, and that was a challenge because on a smaller car, when you share the roof line and you share the door glass and the windshield and the backlight, it kind of sets the profile of the car, despite the fact that you might have different hoods, fenders, deck lids, door outers, which these cars did. So there was a lot of differentiated sheet metal, but the profile was the same, and I think that really hurt Oldsmobile. And remember, this was the mid-1980s when General Motors was really kind of going through a lot of internal challenges. There was the Buick Olds Cadillac, Chevrolet Pontiac, GM Canada reorganization that happened in 1984. Chairman Roger Smith was also, let's say, intent on acquiring higher tech companies like Hughes Electronics and Electronic Data Systems, or EDS, from Ross Perot. And he had this belief that expensive computerized manufacturing systems would increase productivity and profitability and would help the company over the long term. In fact, they did the exact opposite. And General Motors ended up having some significant financial challenges in the early 1990s when a lot of those decisions would come and bite it in the rear. So that was something that also hurt Oldsmobile because that just sapped product development funds, and it was kind of forced to soldier on with some products that were old, like the Cutlass Sierra, which was its volume seller, and the new products that were developed, like the Cutlass Supreme in 1988, were just not great sellers. And I think between all of that, the product changes, the resurgence of Pontiac, the resurgence of Buick, and the lack of funds to really redevelop Oldsmobile's portfolio, that really spelled the end of the brand, unfortunately. Now, I must admit that Olds did have a bit of a resurgence, and in the 1994 and 1995 model years, it would hit almost 500,000 units in sales, but of course, this was far less than what it was selling, as I previously mentioned, in its record years just a few years prior. One of the things that helped Oldsmobile actually was that it, interestingly, decided to introduce a truck, the Bravada. And the Bravada was a vehicle that actually sold pretty well for Olds. and was something that I think buyers didn't quite expect. It's too bad it wasn't just a few years later, because this was obviously before the SUV craze would take off. And perhaps if Olds had introduced the Bravada, or the time frame had been a little bit different and a little bit later, it would have had even more success. But regardless, I think those are some of the reasons why Oldsmobile failed. Really, the product, the marketing, the pinch between Buick and Pontiac, and it just never regained its footing, unfortunately. It's too bad, because Oldsmobile had such a great heritage and had so many great cars over the years. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And interestingly, Olds would plan its centennial birthday in 1997, and they did so with a product roadmap that would go through the 2005 model year. But Oldsmobile would face its demise in the not too distant future. And perhaps that was something that wasn't quite known at the time, even though rumors were speculating and flying at that point. But 2004 would be the last year for Oldsmobile, when it would just have the Alero, and 78,000 vehicles were built in 2004. So Olds went out with a whimper. It started with a bang. And it's just amazing to me how precipitous the fall was. But that's what happens sometimes in the turbulent American auto industry. Put a comment in the comment section. What do you think killed Olds? Is there something that I'm missing? Let me know. Thanks again for watching.